Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar entitled New Beginnings Without Innocence on the Role of Conflict in Community Building. So this is UXIA's traditional theological lecture just before Christmas. My name is Stijn Latré and I'm the director of UXIA University Center, St. Ignatius, Antwerp. Before introducing you to the practicalities and contents of this webinar, I insist on saying thank you to Hilke Gunst, who organized this webinar for us, and also to Annick Willems to make this webinar possible in a technical way. So I think you're already quite familiar with Zoom right now. Maybe unfortunately you got familiar with Zoom because the reason for it is not too positive, of course. But I repeat some practical arrangements. This session is being recorded, so you can also watch it again afterwards. Camera and microphone are by default switched off, so maybe the moderator can later on give you permission to use your microphone in the Q&A, but we will see that. But of course, since we are happy in this lecture to allow some dissent or even conflict, as the title suggests, we don't want to entirely mute the audience. So you can post your questions in the Q&A function, rather in the Q&A function than in the chat, which is more meant for informal messages. I may then take up, because the moderator for tonight, that's me, I may then take up your question for further discussion in the Q&A, or we might, as I said, even open up your microphone. So new beginnings without innocence on the role of conflict in community building. This is indeed the very intriguing theme and title of tonight's lecture. It is often said that our Western-style democracies are, and I'll say it in Dutch, een georganiseerd meningsverschil. So the organization and managing of society with divergence of opinions. That's what democracy is about, where the state itself should not take sides. So for this, for its conceptual framework, our Western democratic societies lean heavily on those notions such as Jürgen Habermas' herrschaftsvrije communication or John Rawls's overlapping consensus. The liberal state then provides us with a framework that tends to ban conflict from the public sphere and agrees on key principles such as the no harm principle, which of course is also a utilitarian principle, not just liberal. We are free to develop our way of life and to express our opinions about it publicly, as long as we do not incite violent actions. And as we found out recently in UXIA's philosophical lecture series on the founding fathers of the social contract, the modern liberal state even came about to reduce or eliminate precisely conflict by creating a strong judicial order. Such is still our heritage of Thomas Hobbes and his homo homini lupus phrase and the Leviathan idea. And maybe I can show you something by sharing my screen. You see here a picture which is also integrated in the UXIA student manual for the summer school course, European Humanism in the Making. And you see here this picture of the Leviathan with his sword, which is the state, Leviathan, a kind of sea monster, with aggregating all the individuals you see on the picture, those small men and women coming together for protection in the state in order to overcome violence. That's what Thomas Hobbes was about, and that was what liberalism has further developed. So, but now we have in the room this bold theologian, this Professor Judith Gruber, whose lecture might challenge this dominant neoliberal paradigm, question mark. So does this paradigm perhaps cover, this liberal paradigm, perhaps cover persisting conflicts and inequalities under a veil a veil not of the Rawlsian ignorance, but a veil of indifference or insensitivity for what moves minority groups in society. Can, for example, the woke movement be seen as a reaction against this indifference or insensitivity? We will just find out in a few minutes, but let me first introduce you further to Professor Gruber. Judith Gruber is Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, of course, and the Director of the KU Leuven Center for Liberation Theologies. She received her PhD in Catholic Systematic Theology from the University of Salzburg, Austria, in 2012, and subsequently held a tenure-track position at, and of course important if you want to work with UXIA, at Loyola University in New Orleans from 2012 to 2017. Her research focuses on the intersection of systematic theology and critical cultural studies, with particular specializations in intercultural theology and postcolonial theology. And of course, there are the number of publications. You can find these, of course, on the internet. She's currently the representative of the European Society for Catholic Theology in the International Network for Societies of Catholic Theologies. And I add to all this that since October of this year, and we are very proud about that, Professor Gruber has become academic advisor for UXIA for our theme line, religion, culture, and society. So, Professor Gruber, dear Judith, welcome to UXIA. And we are very happy and grateful to have you as our academic advisor for the coming years. The floor is now yours until, let's say, 8:15, and then there will be some time for Q&A. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. But first of all, thank you, Stijn, for this very generous and introduction. I'm very, very happy to be joining UXIA. And also, I'm very happy to engage in very, I think, profound discussions. And I think the introduction you gave tonight is already leading right into the core of the issues that we have to discuss, especially also now, I think, in the current societal climate. So thank you very much for the generous introduction of my person, but I think more importantly, also really of the topic. So indeed, what I would like to do today is to speak about the role of conflict in community building. And what I will take as an example or as a case study is a conflict that took place in the Catholic Church. And it is, as you might not be surprised, perhaps, it is a conflict about the representation of women in the church. But I believe, and this is kind of the broader picture that I want to bring in, that the argument I'm trying to develop here tonight is not actually limited to the church. And more importantly, I think by taking this example of a conflict within the church, I don't want to insinuate that conflicts in the church are unique or typical only of the church. And that we perhaps can take from my presentation tonight the idea that we could isolate the church and conflicts in the church from debates that take place within the wider society. This is not my point. On the contrary, the case, I think, is very much that conflicts within the church cannot be separated from wider debates in society. The boundaries between church and world are fluid here, I think we can see. And this means, in turn, that we can interrogate the role of conflict in the church as a test case to think more generally about how we can make sense of the role of conflict in community building. My goal tonight is to make conflict something like the point of departure or the point of construction from which we talk about community. And speaking as a theologian here tonight, I will also explore in which way we can understand conflict theologically. So the question I'm also raising is, can we learn something about the way God becomes manifest in the world by turning our attentions to conflicts in community? And please allow me to share my screen here. Does that work? I hope it does.
Yes, it does. We can see the
wonderful.
slides
Thank you so much. So So I will develop my argument tonight in these four steps. And my reflections are based on the observation that conflict seems to be an irreducible dimension of community. Where there is conflict, where there is community, there is conflict. There is struggle over the fair distribution of resources, struggle for appropriate representation, struggle over the modes of participation in this community. So my question tonight is, how do we develop a theory of community building? And how do we develop also practices of living together that don't ignore this fact of conflict, but theories and practices that can constructively and productively deal with the irreducible fact of conflict? So my argument in a nutshell is that approaches that call for more inclusion actually fall short of addressing the problem of conflict. They try to overcome conflict, but as I will argue tonight, they don't succeed. Instead of such an ethics of recognition that is guided by the idealistic ideal that all voices can speak, what we need instead, I think, is what I will call a politics and a theology of unrecognizability. And the slash is invisible here, but the point is that any kind of recognizability is irreducibly tied to unrecognizability. I will develop this argument in those four steps. I will start by presenting a concrete conflict in the church. And then in a second step, I will turn to the French political philosopher Jacques Rancière and his politics of unrecognizability to develop tools for analyzing this conflict. Thirdly, I will argue that from Rancière's politics of unrecognizability, we can unearth a theological dimension that allows us to understand the theological significance of conflict in community. And building on this, I will develop a new understanding of church and the role of conflict in the church. Church, my argument will be, can be theologically reconfigured as fleeting events of dissent. I will conclude by probing how the church as an institution could perhaps embrace such a self-understanding of dissent as community building. So my question ultimately is, how could the church become a community that is able to constructively develop practices of living together that embrace rather than conceal conflict? And I will take 40.5 minutes to make this point, so please bear with me. So allow me to start my reflections on the conflict in the church as a test case for the role of conflict in community building. And I'll start with a concrete example. Since 2012, Donna Chiesa Mondo is published as a monthly supplement to the Osservatore Romano. Its goal is to grant a public voice to women in the church. From 2012 to 2019, Lucetta Scarafia was chair of the editorial staff. And together with her team of 11 women, she fulfilled this task with passionate and an increasingly critical stance. Towards the end of her tenure, the magazine was also used as a platform to denounce the abuse of religious sisters and the oppression of women in the church. In March 2019, the entire editorial team stepped back. It was an act of protest that achieved global attention through an open letter to Pope Francis, in which Scarafia outlined the reasons for her resignation. She says there had been increasing interference by the Osservatore's new editor, Andrea Monda, and a change in editorial directions had taken away her team's autonomy. Monda, however, has rebutted these accusations, and he has declared that he fully supported an independent publication of the women's magazine. Similar discrepancies came to the fore in the commentaries on the resignation of the international media. Many commentators saw in the developments around Donna Chiesa Mondo proof for the continuing dominance of patriarchal clericalism in the church. Yet, there were also more critical voices who questioned Scarafia on her conservative positions and suggested that she might have felt threatened in her own exclusive position of power as the female voice of the Vatican by an increase of publications of women's themes and women's articles in the Osservatore under the leadership of Monda. In her commentary in The Guardian, Tina Beattie captures these conflicts of interpretation quite well. Writing about Scarafia's resignation with regret, she expresses her solidarity, and yet she does not dismiss critique. Beattie says, Scarafia's outspokenness has ruffled clerical feathers, but she has also been criticized by liberal Catholics for her conservatism with regard to church teachings on issues such as homosexuality. And some Italian feminists complain that she does not engage sufficiently with the views of women who do not belong to her immediate circle. Beattie also offers a nuanced position on the role that Monda played in this dispute. An academic and journalist, Monda is not part of the clerical elite that wages war on Francis' reforms, Beattie says. Another contact in the Italian media suggests that Scarafia is perceived as being too close to the ancient regime, and she has to go in order for real reform to take place. So this was Beattie. Beattie's nuanced observations on the ambivalences in Scarafia's public performance offer resources, I think about conflict and contestation in the church. Her comments should not be understood as an attack ad hominem. Rather, these comments offer rich material to elucidate the political, the aesthetic, and the theological conditions of possibility for recognition, for representation, and for participation in the church. My argument will be that conflicts such as the one around Lucetta Scarafia are a constitutive dimension of community building in the church. They're not an extraordinary disturbance that should ideally be overcome as quickly as possible until all can speak on equal terms. No, I will suggest instead that they allow us to develop an understanding of community as a regime of unrecognizability, and please always have the slash in mind here, a regime of in/visibility that is irreducibly marked and marred by asymmetries of power. And I will further argue that these conflicts have a profound theological cogency that allows us to understand revelation and its representation through the church in new ways. Postcolonial studies offer first analytical tools for understanding the Scarafia case in this way. In the struggle for non-colonial identities, postcolonial theory has developed a sensitivity for how colonial dominance not only takes place through military power and economic exploitation, but colonial dominance is also irresolvably linked to the exercise of epistemic power and epistemic violence. Colonial discourse sets the conditions under which knowledge is produced, disseminated, and evaluated. So groundbreaking work has been done here by Edward Said, who showed that Orientalism is a scientific, a cultural, a political, and aesthetic and economic discourse, so a multifaceted discourse in which knowledge is produced in such a way that it perpetuates the colonial master's hegemony over the colonized. Gayatri Spivak, another highly influential postcolonial theoretician, has in her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, has pointed out just how profoundly colonial and patriarchal dominance informs the representation of marginalized women. Spivak ultimately answers her question whether the subaltern can speak with no. Marginalized women's speech, she argues, is so inextricably bound up in asymmetrical relations of power and representation that it is impossible for subaltern women to speak with an authentic voice. Postcolonial discourse thus struggles with a paradox, and that's the paradox I want to bring into the church here. The struggle for representation we see here takes place under the conditions of hegemonic discourse. The powerful discourse provides the framework within which marginalized voices can be heard. And the powerful discourse remains the organizing principle that informs the struggle for an authentic voice. Scarafia's case, I think, demonstrates this dynamic in exemplary ways. Beatty actually hints at this when she suggests that, and I have the quote here on my slide, Scarafia has maintained her position as one of the few women with a significant voice in the Vatican by way of a precarious balancing act between speaking out on issues of concern while refraining from challenging church teaching. In her public performance, Scarafia drew a clear line between the sayable and the unsayable in the church. These choices that she made, I argue, are best understood not as sly political maneuvering, not sly political maneuvering, but I think these choices that Scarafia made provide a first glimpse at how profoundly established regimes of unrecognizability dictate the conditions of what can be seen and how we can participate in communities. Scarafia speaking as a woman in the church takes place within the normations of a patriarchal clerical discourse that silently but pervasively determines which topics can be addressed, by whom, and in which ways. This is also, and particularly true for those who find themselves at the margins of this discourse, and to those who claim recognition from these marginal positions. As Scarafia became increasingly bold, as Beatty puts it, and as she sought to create recognition for topics that were silenced within those normative boundaries that constitute the ecclesial discourse, she got out of line of this regime of unrecognizability and could eventually only become silent herself. We can further elucidate these insights with the help of Jacques Rancière's political philosophy. For Rancière, politics and aesthetics interlock in the constitution of the world of a community. Communities, he argues, constitute their political order through what he calls distribution of the sensible. These are the processes of differentiation through which a community defines what it considers as visible, as sayable, and as meaningful, and to whom it therefore grants representation and participation. And for Rancière, distribution has a double meaning here. It refers on the one hand to that which allows for participation, and on the other hand, to that which separates and excludes. So distribution gives participation to some and excludes others on the other hand. And it is the crucial point that in any community, there are those who have no part and no participation in its specific arrangement of the visible and meaningful. Representation and participation within a community rest on the exclusion of those who do not have a share in these particular arrangements. And Rancière gives this share of the excluded a name. Those who do not count and those who are not accounted for are the part of those who have no part. The part of those who have no part. So usually they just remain invisible, but with Rancière we can name them as those who have no part. Rancière further argues that there are two ways of how those that have a share in a community can be counted. The first way counts the parts that constitute the community, recognizing those parts and only those parts that actually have a share in this community, that are already visible. This way of counting proceeds in a totalitarian way that reflects precisely the particular arrangements of visibility that are operative in a given community. Rancière calls this way of counting consensus, where we all share a sense of who belongs. This census then, the second way of counting, additionally names a community's part of no part, and thus inserts a gap that marks the excluded into this established order. By naming the part of no part, the census does not simply add a part that has hitherto been missing, but it introduces a fundamentally different perception of reality that disrupts the totalitarian order of consensus and questions the normality of its arrangements of invisibility. Rancière allows us to argue that the struggle for recognition within an established, a totalitarian regime of unrecognizability does not bring real transformation. Such struggle within an established regime does not effect a constitutive change in the regulations for the visibility, the sayability, and realizability of the selected forms of life that this community allows for. On the contrary, such a struggle for a redistribution of representation within a hegemonic regime ultimately rests on a consensus about what and who is already considered visible and sayable, and who is not considered visible and sayable, and in ways that leave no place for a void, so no place for those that have no part. It therefore does not unsettle, but reinforce the existing distribution of the sensible and the selection of those who have a share in it. Struggling for the recognition of women in the church, Donne Chiesa Mondo found itself precisely in this precarious position. This case further shows that the exclusion of the part of those without part is not only and not necessarily achieved through mechanisms of silencing and concealing. Rather, it can also be performed through mechanisms of hypervisibility. The launching of the magazine did not effect a fundamental renegotiation of what can be seen and what can be said about it, and who is able to see something and who is able to speak in the given community of the church. Rather, women's themes were granted recognition at the margins of the totalitarian order of patriarchal clerical arrangements of unrecognizability, in a way that did not fundamentally question the distribution of representation in the church. On the contrary, the hypervisibility of the women's magazine, published as an addendum to the normal Osservatore Romano, silently re-established the dominant male clerical form of representation in the Vatican as normative. A struggle for an increased recognition of women in the church does not unsettle its patriarchal consensus. Rather, an effective transformation of patriarchal clericalism requires something very different. It does not just require more women, but on the contrary, it requires a scrutiny of the patterns of masculinity, of toxic masculinity that have shaped and continue to shape the church. Hence, not until the entire female staff resigned did Donne Chiesa Mondo unsettle the normal order of things in the church. Only their clamoring silence made the women visible as those who are absent from the patriarchal consensus in the church. In the women's resignation, a void, an empty gap appeared in the normal ecclesial order of things for those who have no part in its distribution of the sensible. So only the silence of the women disturbed the consensual mechanisms with which the clerical patriarchal regime normally and silently sustains its self-evidence. And that silencing of the women momentarily deprived these mechanisms of their efficacy. Hence, only as the women ostentatiously relinquished the claim for consensual representation in the church, only then was the normal ecclesial order of things momentarily disrupted and made fleeting space for renegotiating what counts as unrecognizable in the church. Scaraffia's case thus points us to an irresolvable ambivalence in the struggle for women's recognition in the church. It indicates that the struggle to gain recognition within established ecclesial structures actually runs the risk of reinforcing the sovereignty of the established ecclesial structures and of perpetuating the asymmetries in the distribution of power and authority that these structures sustain. Only the women's fleeting silence had a potentially transformative effect. This is a precarious result of the struggle for recognition, and it underlines what Rancière highlights repeatedly. A rupture in the normal order of things is the condition for the possibility of transformation. But such a rupture does not automatically lead to the institution of more just or more inclusive structures. Dissent does not replace the established order of things, but is critically at work within them. It is an accidental, a local, and a precarious activity that is always close to disappearing, and therefore always also close to reappearing. This is, of course, a precarious outcome. It shows that the women's struggle for representation in the church is faced with the prospect of ultimate failure. Yet, such recognition of failure to effect an ambivalent transformation is, and this is what I would like to show in the second half of my lecture, is not a relinquishing of hope. So we have a failure of gaining representation within an established regime of unrecognizability. And now I try to make use and sense of that failure and how we could use it in theological and in political ways. Rather taking Rancière into a theological direction, I would like to suggest that we can, take from this story resources for a renewed understanding of revelation and its representation in the church. Rancière hints at the theological cogency of his political philosophy when he cites Plato to describe the part that has no part as God's part. And when he also maintains that this God's part maintains all that is theological in politics. So with these political theological intuitions, Rancière's approach offers an instructive language for reading biblical accounts of God's presence in the part of those without part. It illuminates that according to the scriptures, revelation appears also as a constellation of recognizability and unrecognizability that is irresolvably tied to political aesthetic processes of in and exclusion. So there is recognizability, and those are political and aesthetic processes of in and exclusion that are here at work. And scriptures, I think, can be read as such that we see something theological going on here. Biblically, the political locus of social invisibility is the preferred theological locus for the manifestation of divine presence. Those who are excluded from society are of highest significance for the appearance of God. Matthew 25 is one of the many prominent passages that speak of the anonymous presence of Christ in those that find themselves in the blind spots of a community. And Matthew 25 also unmistakably links the ability to see God to a doing and undoing of political aesthetic exclusion. According to this passage, God comes into view whenever there is conflict about who can be seen and what can be said about them. God appears, we could say with Rancière, whenever the totalitarian ways of counting the parts of a community are disrupted and a void appears. So Matthew 25 as Christ appearing in the imprisoned, in the hungry, as the anonymous Christ. So this is very much a question of who do we see and who can we see in those who normally appear outside society. And it is a negotiation of what we see in those who we normally don't see. And according to the biblical text here, God can be seen when the normal order of unrecognizably momentarily fails and we see something else. and the possibility for new arrangements of visibility fleetingly appears in those failures of what we normally see. Hence, through such a theologically attuned lens of a politics of dissent, revelation does not appear as a self-evident presence in the church. So revelation is not simply that which the church disposes of, but also it is not found anymore as a theological utopia of eschatological deferral at the end of history. Instead, we can argue with Bradley Johnson that a political theology of dissent suggests to understand revelation in new ways within an apocalyptic framework, not as the catastrophic end of the world, but more literally as the unveiling of a new creation from and within the normal order of things. Such a theological reading of Rancière unsettles binary conceptions of transcendence and immanence as an emergent event that appears in the midst of contingent worlds. We can see revelation as an occurrence that is fully immanent and yet radically different from the historical and social order. Rather than assuming an apparently self-evident and stable difference between transcendence and immanence, that is then either to be preserved in an absolutized church or safeguarded through eschatological deferral. So those, I think, the two options that I see predominantly in the theological discourse today. We see transcendence rather tied into contingent, embodied histories of contestation in which selected forms of life become recognizable and others are made unrecognizable. Through the lens of such a theology of dissent, transcendence appears fleetingly in cases of dissent. So transcendence, I think, in very simple terms, can be described as that we normally do not want to see. But whenever our normal order of how we see things breaks down, transcendence takes place, transcendence happens as new beginning without innocence. So as new beginnings that have a history are irresolvably tied to these histories out of which they emerge and cannot be separated from them. By situating transcendence as a rupture within the normal order of things, a theology of dissent can offer an understanding of transcendence that has transformative effects. As Johnson puts it, the experience of transcendence becomes transformative now, as an occurrence that emerges not teleologically at the end of times, but by the attention we pay to that which is or those who are normally silenced. So the things we usually do not want to see, the things we cannot hear. At the same time, however, and this is crucial for my point, I think such a relocation of transcendence in the fleeting performances of dissent deprives the transformative transcendence of God of self-evidence and unambiguity. Matthew 25 shows how the manifestation of God's presence is irresolvably tied into the struggle for recognition. The passages speak of the appearance of God in the rearrangements of how we see things and how we don't see things. But this passage also mentions those who hold on to the established consensual distribution of the sensible that sees only those who already have a share in it, without leaving a place for a void. However, it is also quite clear in what status those have, those who do not see those without a part, which status they have in a theological epistemology, in a theological way of seeing things. For those who are blind to the dissent with which the part of those without a part appear, a vision of God is foreclosed. Matthew 25 says, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? So those who do not see Christ in those also don't see revelation happening in the blind spots of society. And the point here I'm making is that these are fundamentally ambivalent situations, right? So there's no clear emergence of God's presence here. Emerging from ruptures in the normal order of things God's revelation is never self-evident, but it remains irresolvably tied to renegotiations of what is visible, and it therefore appears ambivalent, and it appears ambivalently. Jesaja makes a similar point. I'm finding this a very strong question here. When God speaks through Jesaja, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? So again, the question mark here of where do we so see God as the newness of creation here that springs forth from what is there already. So unearthing the theological cogency of a politics of dissent, we begin to see that for the hope in a God who makes all things new, there is no innocence, but only the navigations of ambivalence, as Judith Butler put it in a very different context. The crucial point I want to make here is that speaking of the excluded as the locus of revelation should us not lure in a romanticized way of looking at victims or into an ethics of recognition in which ideally all voices should speak. But rather my point here is that theology is irresolvably and perhaps even, and making a strong point here, irredeemably tied into messy struggles for recognition, and it therefore needs a politics of unrecognizability to discern, always inconclusively, where transcendence might have taken place. Revelation theology translates into ecclesiology, and by defining revelation as an occurrence that is fully immanent, but radically different from the historical and social order, a political theology of dissent suggests to reconceive of the church as a sign and instrument of such ruptures in established distributions of the sensible, both in the church, but also in other communities. When the church lives up to its raison d'etre of giving witness to God's presence, it becomes, or it has to become, a sacrament of failure that is called to identify the fleeting moments in which the transformative experience of God's transcendence becomes present as new beginnings without innocence in the midst of existing realities. So the church here, my argument is a sacrament of failure in the way of when those established regimes of visibility fail. When it is performed as a disturbance in the normal order of things, the church remains provisional. It does not replace established institutions, but it is critically at work within them as it appears in the fleeting exposure of irreducibly normative violence in existing institutions, both in the church and otherwise. So in the failures of normative violence to sustain itself, the ecclesial representation of God's presence can become that accidental, that local, that precarious activity that Rancière calls dissent. The reconfiguration of revelation as a rupture in regimes of unrecognizability thus gives us a criterion for ecclesiality that ties the church into struggles for recognition and consequently deprives it of self-evidence and also of an autonomous status. It unsettles the binary structures that have given stability and self-sufficiency to the church when it was considered as societas perfecta, so as a society, as a community that is completely autonomous and independent from the world. When it emerges as a rupture in the order of things, it depends on those orders of things to emerge in the first place. And at the same time, and I want to reiterate the point, we also abstain here from a romanticized identification of the church that is in solidarity with the victims. Instead, I'm suggesting a reconception of the church as a way that collects transformative events that fleetingly appear and disappear from the normal order of things. So what we have here are resources for ecclesiological reconfigurations in which participation and representation within the church are no longer considered as an available good over which we can struggle, right? So they've struggled that they are distributed in a fair way. Rather, church, I think, should be understood as an event that becomes a representation of God's revelation whenever and wherever established constellations of visibility are called into questions. Theologically speaking, then, the struggle for recognition in the church goes beyond a competition over the distribution of representation that remains in a consensual way within the established ecclesial regime of unrecognizability. Rather, we have to shift the whole question to the theologically much more fundamental problem of where the church is momentarily taking place in those ruptures of constellations of visibility. Church no longer appears as a self-evident entity. Rather, church really means to engage in practices of discernment that register where dissent is taking place as a new beginning without innocence in the midst of the normal order of things, both in the church but also in other communities. So if church, and with this I'm coming to my last slide, if church is an event that appears in renegotiations of over who can be seen and what can be said about those we can see and those we cannot see. So if we reconfigure church as such an event, might then the clamoring silence of the women of Donna Chiesa Mondo have been perhaps one of those ruptures in which church becomes manifest as a sign and instrument of failure, a sign and instrument of God's fleeting transcendence as in an event of dissent? Might church have fleetingly happened in this conflict? Such a reading of the women's resignation as a possible instance of ecclesiogenesis is possible, but it is not innocent and it is not unambivalent, I would argue. It can easily be subsumed into a long theological tradition that draws on theological patterns as patterns of interpretation to justify the silencing of women and other non-men in the church. So the church has always been good at glorifying women's silence. And this has long been part of a patriarchal discourse in a clericalized church that draws on sacralized violence to sponsor the derealization of non-male forms of ecclesial life. So through a theology of dissent, the women's resignation can be dignified theologically as a moment of ecclesiality. But when we do that, we are engaging in risks again here. At the very same time, however, and thus in irreducibly ambivalent ways, the women's silence and its ecclesiological significance can reveal a renewed understanding of church. It offers blocks towards a dissenting church in which and through which transformation could indeed take place. Never unambivalently, never uncontested, never totally, but still effectively. And I would like to conclude with this view towards transformation through conflict that we think that we can take from the Scarafia case. This case indicates, I think, in which ways a reform towards a dissenting church could be pursued, and in which ways the church could thus become a model for a community that takes conflict seriously as its point of construction. So the women's perhaps failed struggle for recognition shows that ruptures in the normal order of things expose the irreducible workings of normative violence in ecclesial tradition. And yet they promise no deliverance from the powerful mechanisms of normative violence. So the struggle of recognition produces ruptures, but it doesn't go beyond the struggle for recognition and the powerful mechanisms of normative violence. In a way, it fails, and yet such failure does not dispense from efforts for reform that seek to engage with, to undo the violence which sponsors established regimes of ecclesial recognizability and unrecognizability. So, on the contrary, we can perceive such failure, and this is, I think, the crucial sentence for me tonight, we can perceive such failure as the theological locus of transcendence the ecclesiological locus of ecclesiogenesis, of where church emerges, and the political locus of transformative agency. So I'm highlighting failure here. And my argument is that through and as failure, the struggle for community can take place. Failure resists institutionalization. It does not replace established institutions, but it is critically and fleetingly at work within them. So we cannot just have a church that is dissent, but dissent happens within institutions that are already established. And still this, because I've argued for the theological significance of that failure, we also see, I would also argue that the church is called to establish organizational forms and leadership styles that allow it to fail better, as Samuel Beckett also put it in a different context, famously. So that theological significance of failure calls for a post-heroic ecclesiopolitics that can embrace the transformative potential of failure. Such a reform through failure will reconstitute the church as democracy. Democracy, not in the sense of which Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have warned when they highlighted that the consensus fidelium cannot be equated with the majority opinion. Rather, when I talk about the church as a democracy, I have Rancière's definition in mind, who defines democracy as a momentary state of exception in which the violent mechanisms of self-evidence fail and allow to renegotiate what can be seen and what can be said in a given community. As such a democracy, as such a state of exception, the church will not pursue the utopian goal of a space that it inhabits that is free of violence, a space in which all can speak on equal terms. But rather, as a democracy, it is called to register the disruptive and potentially transformative power of failures in the normal order of things, and the way this normal order maintains its self-evidence. Through such a conflictive approach, a democratic or a dissenting church continues the struggle to expose and undo normative violence, knowing that it will fail, knowing that we cannot institute that on a permanent basis, knowing that we will fail again and again. A dissenting church represents God in new beginnings, in always new beginnings without innocence, or as the German sociologist Armin Nassé has put it recently and rather untheologically in his new book, Unbehagen, when he says that the right life can only emerge in the wrong one. So this is the proposal I have to make for tonight. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to engaging in conversation now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Gruber, for this very inspiring and crystal clear lecture with a very nice build-up in 4 parts. I have a lot to ask, actually, but I also invite the audience to do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So the double text balloons, you can post your questions over there. Yeah, meanwhile, some comments, perhaps. I was intrigued by your talk about failure as a basic category for theology and revelation. It reminds me of, well, we're in Christmas times, or approaching Christmas, and also after Christmas, Epiphany, which is the feast of the Revelation. And there we have, of course, the story of God that is in the part that has no part. So the 3 magicians from the East cannot come to Jerusalem because the established powers over there hang on and stick to their power. And God is actually born far away from the center, in marginal areas, in a manger. So in a part that has no part in society. So that story of the Gospel of Epiphany is really a very good illustration, I think, of this theology of failure in a way. And then you talk about it also as a foundation for ecclesiology. It's one of the domains you can apply this category to. You said in the last slide, the ecclesiogenesis. So I'm wondering, how do you match this theology of failure and dissent by Rancière with contemporary attempts in church, like synodality, so inspired by the Pope, and also, yeah, maybe early Christian church tendencies like the ones in Paul and Paul's universalism. It seems to me that in a way, the church has this discourse of diversity in unity, in wholeness. We need some kind of unity, and the Christian love is a kind of cloak you can spread over cultural differences. That's what it is in Paul, in a way, because he says you don't have to become a Jew before you become a Christian. As a pagan, you can directly become a Christian. When people of the communities of the first churches ask him what to do when Christ is about to return to earth, then he says, remain in your secular status, your intentionality, your being directed to Christ. That's all what matters to God. Your secular worldly status is in a way indifferent. So in that way, you see both maybe in this process of synodality, I don't know, I'm not a theologian, I'm not engaged in it very much, but there is a lot of talk about it. And in the way Paul's universalism took root actually in the church, there is maybe a way that is sidelining this epistemology of failure, so to say, and this transformative potentiality, so to speak, of this category of failure. That's the first, maybe already too large questions. I have others to ask, but yeah. I don't know, maybe you disagree. It's the webinar of the dissent today. You disagree with my observations. So
as a matter of fact, I do not disagree. I fully agree. And I think there's you're speaking, I think, in a lot of ways of towards failures, and also to the other crucial point I want to make about ambivalence or ambiguity, perhaps, in a way, right? I mean, there's a lot to say about your points about how Epiphany speaks to failure, and I think I love that comment here in the chat of how Christmas and Easter are epic failures, yes. Right? And I would fully agree, and I think reading those as epic failures, I think is one of the points I think that we can make about the theological traditions of how we have so gotten used to triumphalist narratives, right, to also teleological narratives, right, so that we see, for example, Easter only through the lens of resurrection, right, and we stop at the resurrection and forget what kind of failures, what kind of struggles there are actually at place. And when we see a resurrection, we can actually add another story. And for me, a very good story of failure is also the Emmaus story of Christ walking with the disciples, them not recognizing Christ. And as soon as they recognize Christ, Christ is gone already. So for me, there's this very much this play of what do we see, what don't we see, how do we fail to see, but once we see through the eyes of failure, we begin to see in much richer ways, actually, of what is at stake and of what can we grab. I won't make a big comment on synodality now, but I think it's one of those things into which, one of those concepts that I think would align in really interesting ways with the theology of dissent. But I think that's also really important to bear that concept of ambiguity or ambivalence in mind, right? So that it can is also prone, as any theological concept, it is prone to perhaps a teleological, right, interpretation in which it is clear into which direction we move, into what kind of unity diversity is to be integrated and so on. So in a way that failure is no space anymore. But of course, synodality is also open to other readings that allow for, more complex, more complicated readings that in that, I would really, I think there's more to be said about this, but I would really plead for an open concept of synodality. And as one of my PhD students has actually just started a project on this, where he wants to make, with a lot of passion, wants to make the argument that synodality is not the miracle fix for all the problems of the church, where we all come together, but a way of a new understanding of church that really speaks to this ongoing, inconclusive way of being on the way, right? So there's, I think, let us not forget failure as we talk about synodality.
Okay, thank you very much for these comments. There is a question in the Q&A, and it's about social media, which do not have a very good reputation at building communities. And they are using, of course, a lot of polarizing language. I think that the comment and the question is hinting at that. Is the failure maybe of social media also a locus of revelation?
Yeah, another very good point. Yeah, and a lot to be said again, but I think I want to limit myself to the comment that social media and the very real effects in the real world that social media have, I think, is again, I think, a point that has shown us, especially in recent times, to not romanticize conflict, right? So when I hear advocate for a theology of dissent, for embracing conflict as the point of construction in community, I want to make it crystal clear that this is not, that I'm not romanticizing the idea, that I know and or want to have in mind, and also want to point out in no unmistaken terms that this is often a conflict of life and death, right? So so not the idea of that we come together in diversity, but that these are real struggles that can be death-bearing. And interestingly enough, social media show that in those very changing ways, in a way, precisely because they're at first stage not in the real world and still have that major impact. Yeah.
There is a comment on historical cases of church history. I think the hint is a bit that, or the hunch there is a bit that, of course, yes, in Rome, the central orthodoxy developed a kind of theology which excluded certain groups, of course, and which considered these groups as failures, and so took in the notion of failure in a totally different way, I guess, not as something enriching discourse, yeah, but something as really threatening the hegemonic discourse or power. So how about the ambivalence of this category of failure? It can really be used as part and parcel also of the hegemonic
absolutely, and
discourse.
it totally is. And I think this is reiterating also the point which is really important to me, is that the non-romanticization of conflict, right? And perhaps in response to those really historical cases, I think I can just go back to what Rancière says, who makes it also, who highlights repeatedly that dissent is a fleeting event that can easily be overseen or can be missed, right? Uh-huh. So again, dissent is not something that can be institutionalized, but it breaks open within institutions. And something I haven't highlighted so strongly, but I think that's kind of the flip side of the coin, is that, of course, established, and I call this in such abstract terms, the regimes of unrecognizability. So the normal order of things, right, of course, has a major interest, but it also has major resources, capital resources, epistemic resources, the resources of violence, right, to suppress those failures of where it breaks open, right? So of course, those others are termed failures. And so I think with Rancière, we can I don't know, sharpen our senses, I think would be a good way of putting it, sharpen our senses to those really maybe invisible moments of when the normal order of things breaks down. And it's not just Rancière who says that, it's also Gaudium et Spes Gaudium et Spes 11, which talks about the need of discernment to see God's presence in the world. So, and I think there would be another article in that, of really bringing that together, of how God is not, theologically speaking, God is not immediately present, but it really needs that careful sharpening of senses of wanting to see God, knowing that this is always ambivalent, and of course also, yeah, not a power-free movement. So who can claim God for their way of seeing things? And that remains an open question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a last question, because time is rushing, and we're already exceeding actually the time we had planned for this webinar. So last question, a very interesting remark from and question from Bruno Spriet. In this theology of dissent and failure, what is the role exactly of protest and opposition versus silence and failure, as you call it? Does opposition have to fail then necessarily, always to be a place of revelation? There are also oppositions which do not fail and take part in revelation, like David who defeats Goliath. Classical liberation theology in this slide speaks of the need for liberation in the here and now, but also in the ultimate coming of the kingdom. What would be your comment on that?
I think this is a crucial question, and it really addresses the major intervention I think I'm trying to make in the field of ecclesiology here by drawing on Rossier is to not hinge or to not tie those ruptures, right, to a fixed telos, or to theologically speaking, to the kingdom of God that comes at the end of times, right? There's a whole theological argument to make, and how this is actually how such a teleological telling of history, in a way that perhaps classic liberation theology very much relies on, can be very much a hegemonic move of subjecting, there's a lot to say actually, of subjecting the victims to, or using victims perhaps to move closer towards that telos as one problem and also so my problem, or the point I want to make here is what is actually the danger of having a telos at the end of history, right? And who determines that telos? And what happens when we really try to fully understand of how our God talk, incarnationally speaking, is really tied into the world and interrupts the world from there? Can we actually rely on that telos again? And then on the other hand, of course, the question remains is, how do we do theology if we are not kind of hinging it on that transcendent reality? So those are open questions that need more elaboration, I think, but it can be argued for, I would like to say at this point.
Okay, thank you. We'll conclude the evening here. I have a lot of questions to ask, also from, as I am a philosopher, from a philosophical angle, as you already noticed with my introduction. Of course, there is a lot to say about society in this respect, and how dissent can build society. We could talk about Nietzsche and Foucault perspectives. I also, the question crossed my mind. So, could we consider secularization, our secular age, as a sacrament of failure of the church, in a way, in also the ambivalent meaning that maybe it has come about because of this toxic masculinity and hanging on to certain power structures for too long? On the other hand, secularity and secular age is challenging the church. This may be a kind of theological moment to reflect on the church and its meaning, its mission for the world. But for that, I invite you also to Uxia's February event, which is on church building in a secular time, and I'm sure we will be able to discuss this more elaborately on that occasion. So I thank you for this really, if I also may put it in an ambivalent way, really successful lecture about failure. Maybe it was successful because it was about failure. So I thank you a lot for this inspiring evening, and I hope to hear and see more of you in upcoming Uxia events, and of course, as an academic advisor, we surely will. So
thank you very
good evening
much
to all of you, to the audience. Thanks for being with us, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.